How's it going, everyone? It's Harvey from Weather Swan 5000, and right now, taking a look at Hurricane Lee, we do see that there's still quite a bit of rotation going on, and it's still maintaining somewhat of a level of organization to keep it at near major hurricane status. Right now, it has just fallen below major hurricane status. Its wind speed is hovering around 105 miles per hour at the time of this recording, so it is now considered a Category 2, and it likely will continue to weaken when it comes to shear wind speed as this continues ahead further northward and the wind field expands even more. However, don't be necessarily fooled by just the wind speed of Hurricane Lee as it moves further northward, because although it might sound like good news that, of course, the maximum wind speed is weakening, that doesn't really give a good indication of the just the magnitude and the power of this storm, because even though the maximum wind speed will weaken, the wind field will expand, so its impact will be a lot larger than what you'd expect for a storm that has a wind speed like right now with 105 miles per hour. The wind field is definitely expanding thanks to baroclinic instability having more of an influence of this storm as it continues ahead further northward, and this storm will be very large by the time it approaches New England. So you should see a prolonged period of wind impacts, as well as a stronger amount of storm surge and what you'd expect for a Category 1 hurricane or Category 2 hurricane, because with a larger wind field, that means that the wind has a much larger area to where it could pile up the ocean water and create much stronger storm surge and wave heights along the coast. So just because the wind speed is weakening does not necessarily mean that this storm is any less significant or any less impactful, because it'll still be a much stronger storm than what you'd expect for a Category 1 hurricane as it approaches New England. Taking a look at the current wind shear map over the northern Atlantic, and we do see the northern side of this storm is especially experiencing stronger wind shear. Of course, this is due to a trough moving through the northern portion of the Midwest at this time. This is the same trough that's gonna allow it to move just east enough to avoid, let's say, entering the mid-Atlantic, but it will still come close enough to a point where Maine could experience direct impacts, potentially a landfall, and a large portion of New England could still easily experience tropical storm force winds, because even if the eye is hundreds of miles off the coast or away from your location in New England, the wind field, like I said, will be huge with this storm. So a large portion of New England will at the very least experience gustier winds this Saturday as this moves northward. But the wind shear will only increase as this continues ahead further northward. And while that might be good news, because of course stronger wind shear does typically weaken storms, in this case it won't necessarily weaken it that much, because for one thing is that the strong upper level winds are moving the same direction as the center of circulation, which means that the winds, especially on the eastern side, will only be amplified by the strong upper level winds, because they're both moving at the same direction, which means that all that force is going to converge towards one direction, which is from the south, which means that especially the eastern half of this storm will experience even stronger winds with these stronger upper level winds, since both the center of circulation and the winds are moving the same direction. And another thing too is, like I said, the baroclinic instability associated with this trough moving through, that's gonna cool down temperatures around the northeast, and mixing those cooler temperatures with a very warm core tropical entity, that's gonna create instability for the wind speed to increase. It'll lose some of its tropical characteristics, but it'll still maintain its strength for the most part, even as the maximum wind speed decreases. Of course, Hurricane Franklin isn't the only thing we're keeping an eye on. We also have what likely will become Tropical Storm Nigel in the very near future. 80% chance of developing within the next 48 hours. And I'm at least right now expecting this to become a hurricane in the more long-term future. We're going to need to see if this could potentially impact Bermuda, because it almost looks like it's going straight towards Bermuda's direction. but it's still a little bit too far out to say. And you're probably wondering if maybe this could have a chance to come close to the East Coast. It's still way too far to say right now. The computer models are leaning against that as of the recent runs, but we could see changes in the forecast. So I'll keep you guys updated if we see any significant changes where it could be an imminent and dangerous threat to land. But for right now, we're likely to see a tropical storm, and that's pretty much all we know as of right now. We also have Hurricane Margaret, but isn't going to be an imminent threat to land, which is certainly good news. So in this video, we're primarily going to focus on Hurricane Lee. So in terms of what the latest runs of the computer models are stating at this time, now there's a high level of certainty with the forecast. I did mention in my previous videos that right around the Wednesday time, we should really get a good idea of where exactly the storm will go. And now we have a pretty much a general idea of where this storm will make landfall and who it'll directly impact. It'll most likely bring direct impacts towards the eastern portion of Maine, as well as the the Nova Scotia area. That's where you should experience direct impacts. I think it's unlikely at this point. We're going to see the center of circulation move far west enough to where we'll see a landfall in Massachusetts. You can't rule it out because two-thirds of the time, a tropical cyclone stays within the cone of uncertainty. So there's still a 33% chance this storm system might go out of the cone of uncertainty, and that still means that Massachusetts has technically a chance of a landfall. However, I think it's unlikely at this time. We're going to see just enough of a weakness in ridging to where to the point where the winds won't really shift from the southeast to where it could push the storm a little bit further westward towards Massachusetts, but it'll still move far west enough to where Maine will experience direct impacts. And even, like I said, even if the storm is hundreds of miles off the coast, look at the isobars. They're really tight, even hundreds of miles away from the center of circulation, which means that a large portion of New England will experience gustier winds. Even as far west as Connecticut and Long Island, you could experience wind gusts of over 40 miles per hour. And in fact, there's actually storm surge forecasted for pretty much the entirety of Long Island, where you could experience up to 1 to 2 feet of storm surge flooding right up along the coast, which is pretty crazy since this storm system will probably be over 200 miles away from Long Island and Connecticut, but you still could experience storm surge flooding, which shows the magnitude of how large a storm is, which is the reason why I say to not underestimate this storm, just because the wind speed might not be as strong as let's say it is right now or as it was before, because we still see the millibar pressure hovering around 965 millibars. That's equivalent to what you'd see in a Category 3 hurricane. It would be a Category 1 in this scenario, probably anywhere between 80 to 85 miles per hour in maximum sustained wind speed. But since the energy is so spread out and the wind field is so large, it's considered to have a strength that's very similar, or impact that's very similar to what you'd experience in a storm much stronger than a Category 1. So this will still be a pretty impactful storm for much of Maine, even the coastal areas of Massachusetts. You could experience wind gusts over 60 miles per hour. This includes the Cape Cod area as well as Boston. And then right around Maine, I wouldn't be surprised if you experience wind gusts over 80 miles per hour. And like I said, it should be over a fairly prolonged period because the wind field is just going to be so large with this storm. So power outages are likely right around Maine and even the coastal areas of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, because this wind is going to be very persistent over a very prolonged period, like I said, and storm surge flooding is of course expected. In terms of rainfall, the good news is that this storm system will move relatively quick. Of course, that's typical for a storm system that moves this far up northward. That's when the upper level winds really become much stronger, and the overall instability you find a lot further northward enhances the surface level wind speed to a point where storm systems move a lot faster when they move further northward, which is certainly good news that will limit the potential rainfall threat for much of New England, but you still could experience a large area of 3 to 5 inches of rain, which is enough for flooding, and that doesn't even include the possibility of flash flooding embedded in some of these thunder showers this hurricane produces. So definitely you need to start preparing now. It's likely hurricane watches are already issued for the coast of Maine, and tropical storm watches are even issued for a large portion of the Massachusetts coast, and even extending as far west as the Rhode Island Connecticut border, which is pretty insane. Taking a look at the European model also shows a very similar forecast, very similar strength, which makes me believe that we're going to see a landfall anywhere that's very close to where the Maine and Canadian border will be. It seems like the computer models are honing in towards that direction. And if this were to somehow make landfall along the coast of Maine as a hurricane, that would be the first time since 1969 Maine experienced a major hurricane. So it's been quite some time. It's been 54 years since Maine last experienced a hurricane landfall, and it'll be pretty insane to see it if this were to happen. But even not, just a hurricane in general going this far up north impacting Maine is just very rare. It's almost a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see a hurricane this far up north and bring impacts up towards Maine. So throughout Maine and the coast of Massachusetts, definitely prepare for the worst. This will be a storm for the ages, as this storm will be, like I said, very powerful. Look at its millibar pressure. So make sure to prepare accordingly in those areas. The good news is, of course, with any tropical cyclone that moves this far up northward, is that the sea surface temperatures will quickly drop below the 80-degree threshold. So we're more likely to see a gradual weakening as this continues ahead towards the coast of Maine. But unfortunately, at the same time, when a storm moves this far up north, it typically moves a lot faster. So it won't really have that much time to really gradually weaken before it reaches the coast of Maine, despite the cooler sea surface temperatures. But still, this should keep it from being a stronger storm, but it will still be very impactful for the coast of Maine, as well as Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and even as far east as as far west as Long Island and Connecticut. Here are what the ensemble members are stating, and it's pretty much what you'd expect at this point. And the computer model has been very persistent on this over the past several days. So it's likely it's going to make landfall anywhere between Maine and Nova Scotia. There could be slight variations in the forecast, but I don't think anything major to a point where Massachusetts could experience a landfall. So in Maine and Atlantic Canada, expect direct impacts at this point, as it's unlikely we're going to see any major changes with the forecast. So here's a storm surge forecast for the entirety of New England, and we do see a large area, pretty much the entirety of the Maine coast, extending towards the small coast of New Hampshire, and Boston Harbor could experience 1 to 3 feet of storm surge, and the peak storm surge is expected to be right around the Cape Cod Bay area. This is where you should experience a strong northerly flow, and since all this ocean water will funnel in towards this small area, towards the Cape Cod Bay, it'll create a funnel effect to where the storm surge will enhance right around the Cape Cod area. So expect a little bit more storm surge flooding. And if you don't know what storm surge flooding is, pretty much go over normally dry ground right up along the coast, add 2 to 4 feet of water on top of that, and that's how much storm surge flooding you should expect right up along the coast. And remember, all it takes is just 6 inches of water to knock you off your feet, and 2 feet of water to move a car. So if you're in a very vulnerable area right up along the coast in any of these areas where 2 feet of storm surge flooding is certainly possible, you need to definitely prepare accordingly. Make sure to park your car in an area that won't be as exposed to the storm surge flooding, and make sure to just stay away from the coast, and turn around, don't drown if you see a body of water, because typically the body of water you see on the road is a lot deeper than what you'd expect. And unfortunately, a large portion of deaths related to flooding are related to vehicle incidents where people anticipated that the water was a lot more the floodwaters were a lot more shallow, but unfortunately it's simply a lot deeper than what you'd expect, and and people making that false assumption that it's shallow unfortunately led to a lot of flooding related deaths. So definitely don't take the risk if you see a body of floodwaters. Make sure to just turn around, don't drown, like the National Hurricane Center advises. And it's not only coastal flooding you need to worry about. You also need to worry about just regular river flooding associated with heavy rainfall, where right around eastern Canada, that's where the peak of the heaviest rainfall should be, where you should expect anywhere from 3 to 5 inches of rain, which is certainly enough to cause major river flooding in some areas. And then even extending as far west as coast of Boston, you should expect anywhere from 1 to 3 inches of rain, and flash flooding is certainly possible around localized areas in Boston and Massachusetts. So definitely be prepared for that possibility. This even extends a little bit further westward into Rhode Island as well. And remember, this rainfall forecast is subject to change, because if the storm were to move a little bit further westward than expected, then expect the heaviest rainfall to move a little bit further westward. And even a 20-mile shift further westward could mean the difference between Boston maybe experiencing 1 inch of rain to potentially experiencing up to 5 inches of rain. So you need to prepare for that possibility in case we see the storm move a little bit further westwards, for the possibility of even more rainfall and potentially even more river flooding in a lot of these areas. And here's the forecasted wind for much of the East Coast, or wind speed for much of the East Coast, right around Friday evening at 8 p.m. And we do see wind gusts, even though the eye is still far away from New England, we still see wind gusts between 40 to 50 miles per hour right around Cape Cod. And the strong winds even extend as far west as Long Island and the Jersey Shore. So this is certainly something you need to pay attention to, even a little bit further westward, for just gustier winds. It won't be anything major right around Long Island and Connecticut. I wouldn't say it's until you go from Boston eastward is where the wind should be rather significant, where you could experience wind gusts over 60 miles per hour and widespread power outages throughout Maine and the coast of Massachusetts. But you still want to keep in mind of the stronger wind gusts, especially since they're going to be a little bit more prolonged over Long Island due to the large wind field of this storm. So definitely make sure to bring those looser items inside, because those could be flying projectiles that could potentially damage your home or other people's property. So here's the National Hurricane Center's latest projected path for Hurricane Lee, and it's pretty certain. Like I said, it's going to hit anywhere between Nova Scotia and Maine, and hurricane watches are issued in the areas that are under the projected path at this time, where you could experience hurricane-like conditions. Wind gusts over 80 miles per hour are certainly possible right up along this area of Maine. And then for much of coastal Massachusetts and the western coast of Maine, you should expect wind gusts around 60 miles per hour, enough to cause power outages and damage, and many trees down, of course. And then the tropical storm watches extend as far west as the Rhode Island and Connecticut border. So definitely keep this in mind at this point, and make sure to prepare for the worst right up along the coast of Maine. But that's it for now, guys, and I thank you guys for watching, and make sure to stay safe all throughout New England for this weekend, and I hope you guys have a great day.